Now, we're going live, okay? We are live, okay. He sent us live. Listen, please let us know if the crackling is there. I don't hear it. Mel, you don't hear it, right?
No. Sounds good, no?
Let's continue on then. Now, Mel, when we started this live stream the first time, I was just asking you to introduce yourself. Now, not everybody knows you from my group. So go ahead, give us a background as to why you're interested in Islam. What got you interested? Why particularly are you interested in the 7th century and this historical material? So over to you.
Yeah. So my channel is Sneakers Corner. Just to start off, it is just a play on the word Speaker's Corner for those who are not sure about that. There's 3 people on our team. There's a guy called Murad, who's an Arabic speaker, and he's an ex-Muslim. And he has fantastic knowledge of the Islamic tradition and looking at a critique of it, as which I'm into as well. And then there's another guy in our team who's a polyglot. His name is Bala, and he typically will read about 10 books for each video that he does. So that's our team. And what got me into it, as I mentioned earlier on, was your dear self. I had watched one of your videos about 5 years ago. And I heard you say that you spoke in Speaker's Corner, and it was a particular time each Sunday. So I said, I'll have to go down and say hello and shake your hand. And that's what really got me into it. I started reading up. And I was obviously interested in Dan Gibson and Patricia Crone in the early days. And Patricia Crone really destroyed the Islamic tradition story straight off, because the whole idea of a trading... Yeah, well, first of all, way down in Mecca is the middle of a desert whose soil conditions is very similar to that of the moon. There's almost nothing growing there. And yet the description in the Islamic tradition is it's full of trees and there's streams and there's olive groves and stuff like that. The sort of thing you'd find in the Mediterranean. And then there was the impracticability of it that, to bring goods across the desert from Mecca up to Syria is incredibly uneconomical. So the equivalent of, let's say you were bringing, 10 kilos of goods and you wanted to bring them up to, say, Damascus, you could go 1,250 miles by sea for the same cost as you could go 50 miles by land. So there's no comparison. So that totally destroyed it. And then another part of her side of things was the fact that the Arabs in the Hijaz had nothing really to trade. The Europeans were already getting their spices directly from India via the Ethiopian trade route. So all the Arabs had in the Hijaz were cheap leather goods and wool goods that were of inferior quality to what the Syrians could produce. So, once I realized that opened up things. And of course, then Dan Gibson...
Where did you hear all this? Because did you read Meccan Trade in the Rise of Islam?
Oh, it did. Yeah.
Okay, she wrote that in 1987.
Yeah, and it turned out to be very accurate. I think it's one of her best works.
For those of you who aren't aware of what we're talking about, let me just back up. Dr. Patricia Crone was head of department. She got her at Oxford University when she wrote Meccan Trade in the Rise of Islam, and she was also she was the one when she was getting her doctorate at SOAS under Dr. John Wansbrough, she could read and write 15 languages, archaic language. These aren't modern languages. These are archaic languages. Syriac. She could read Akkadian. She could read Aramaic, and of course, the beginning of what we now know today as Arabic. So she was one of the few in the world that could actually go back to those documents, to go back to the time period, the 7th century, and understand almost everything she was reading. And she was way ahead of everybody else. She did what no one else had yet to do. And that was she had actually gone in and read these original documents. We're talking about trading documents from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century, and couldn't find any reference to these Arabs. Couldn't find any reference to these Arabs who were supposedly controlling the trade according to the Islamic traditions. They were the head of the trade. Remember Montgomery Watt? Do you know that name, Mel?
I have. I don't know much about him, but I've heard the name mentioned.
Well, he is the one that created the trade route theory. The trade route theory that I was taught when I was in school, in seminary, when I was studying Islam way back in the 1990s. We were brought up on Montgomery Watt's trade route theory, and the theory was that this trade that came from India, way over in the east, so on this side, from India, all coming over to the Mediterranean world. It had to come across India because it was coming from China. It was coming from other areas in the east over here, but it could not go up over. They didn't go up over the northern area because of the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush. So it had to go elsewhere, and so it came down to India, and then it went to the western coast of India, and from the western coast of India, it then went across the what we call the Arabian Sea, over into the Persian Gulf. That was where the trade always went, and that was well known, and there's lots of documentation for that. But then he said, Watt said that in the 600s and the 500s and the 600s, so we're talking about 6th and 7th century, these two great empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire, the Sassanids, started warring with each other and started confronting each other. That shut down the Persian Gulf. There was no way that trade could go that route anymore. It had to be redirected and had to go down south across the Arabian Sea over to Aden in the south. And then from there, according to his theory, it then went up through Aden to Najran, Sana, Taif, and then down to Mecca, down 1,000 meters to Mecca, and then would come up 1,000 meters to get back up to Yathrib, Khaybar, Tabuk, and then up to Gaza in the north. So that was his theory. And of course, I grew up with that. You wouldn't have heard about this, Mel, this early. No. So this is something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just even from what I know at this stage, it's amazing that he managed to get that theory out and people believed it, because you only need to have even the scantest knowledge of the landscape to realize how ridiculous that was, particularly when there was a sea right next to it, which the Ethiopians were using. I think it's the Red Sea, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
Yeah, we'll get to that, because and this is something that Patricia Crone picked up on. She had also grown up with the trade route theory, and no one really questioned it. Everybody assumed that's how Mecca became great. That's why Mecca was so important, because it was at the center of this trade route going up the western coast of Arabia on the plateau, what they call the Western Plateau, until she looked at a map. And then she was curious. She said, why hadn't anybody looked at a map? When you look at a map, you will see that Mecca is not on that trade route. It's down off the trade route, down in the valleys, down in the wadis. It doesn't have any water. It only has this one Zamzam well. And therefore, it could not have accommodated these large caravans that it would have needed to if it was really on a trade route as significant as what we're reading about and what we're hearing and what we're assuming. And so she said, hold on a minute, you can't have a trade route that goes through a place called Mecca at all. And so she said, why hadn't anybody noticed this? And so she said, that's why she decided to go back and check these out. Using her skills in linguistics, she decided to go and read the trade route documents, which is what Montgomery Watt should have done, which is what everybody should have done. And of course, they hadn't done it. And so that's why it's fascinating to me that somebody of her caliber finally looking at something as simplistic as the Western trade route. And as you noted, Mel, the only thing that she could find that they traded were leather and pieces of wool, and that all the spices were down in the southern parts of the peninsula in the Hadramaut area. And this area, the Hadramaut area, is where you get the frankincense and myrrh. Those are the only two spices. So she wrote this book. You read the book, and it has 15 chapters, doesn't it? And she takes a spice per chapter, every one of the 15 major spices, and follows them through and says none of these spices are from Arabia. They're all either from China or India or Africa. And then she said, if you look at all the trade documents, look at the names on the trading documents. There's no Arab names on those documents. The names that you find there are Eritrean names. Agilis is the name that comes up all the time. Agilis, the city of Agilis, which is in what today is Eritrea. Back then, it would have just been Abyssinia. And it's the Africans that controlled the trade. It was the Africans that plied the boats. The Arabs were not seafarers. You look on the western coast of Arabia, you don't see many ports there. You do today, one or two. Jeddah is now there, but there weren't back then.
Muawiyah was the first one to actually consider getting ships, to create a navy in that. But before that, there was none. So there's also the issue of incense lost its value at that time as well. Like in pagan times, incense was used in all the temples, but it wasn't as in high demand. So economically, it wasn't the big thing in the 7th century as it used to be in, say, the 2nd or 3rd century. But another area I'd like to draw our attention to is the work of Angelica Neuwirth, who's a German scholar. And her work basically, even though she's not what we might call an Islamist, she noted that the Quran was in dialogue with sects and cultures that you find in Syria and Northern Arabia, and not what you would find in the middle of a desert. And now she didn't draw the obvious conclusion, which is, well, it mustn't have been created in the Hijaz, because there is no cultural context. And this is, I suppose, she's probably drawing also from Wansbrough's work there. But once you realize that the Quran is in dialogue with northern cultures like Syria.
Back a minute. What do you mean with What are you referring to there? Help the people who are coming. Because you're saying things that most people haven't heard before. What do you mean by Wansbrough's work? What did Wansbrough come up with?
Yeah, so back in the 1970s, Wansbrough wrote a book called Sectarian Milieu. And he asked the sort of obvious question is, okay, what was going on in the background to the Quran? What were the sects that the Quran is in dialogue with? And he looked at the context of the 7th century in terms of Syria, the Syrian background, the multiple various Christian sects, the Jewish sects, and so on, in order to kind of connect it to the Quran. And what was obvious was that the Quran had very little to do with the Hijaz and had an awful lot to do with what was going on up in the north. And so that kind of opens up the lid on exactly what was happening in terms of the creation of the Quran. So that, for me, that was a very key element. Now, she didn't draw the obvious conclusion that Mecca mustn't have been where it happened. She kind of sticks to that Islamic tradition despite her work. Currently, she's working on a critical edition of the Quran, where she's trying to analyze every single ayah and surah in the Quran and look at the context in which it was written as best she was able to analyze it. So that's still a work in progress. So she's definitely one to look out for in the future.
Well, yeah. Go back to Wansbrough again, because one of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of is that Wansbrough was doing this in the 1970s. We're talking about, my goodness, 50 years ago. He was asking this very good question. Now, I'm just noticing people are coming onto the comment section. Any of you who are coming onto the comments, if you have any questions that you want to throw at us, Mel or myself, put them up in the comments, and I'll bring them over onto the screen, and we'll try to answer this. This is a live session. We want to make sure that we also engage with you and that we're able to answer your questions. Thanks, Applegoo, for your finances there. But do come on board. Do ask us questions. Mel's here. We'll be doing all these in the future weeks as well. But as an introductory talk, since this is an introductory talk with Mel, this is my first time I've had you on live stream. So I want to really unpack more your background, what you're coming from. Talk about John Wansbrough. John Wansbrough noticed that an awful lot of the phraseology, an awful lot of the stories, an awful lot of the material that he sees in the Quran just don't exist, could not have existed that early and in that area of the world. Unpack that a bit.
Yeah, so there are lots of stories that he was able to identify, and actually other scholars before him were able to identify as coming from a Syriac background. So there's an awful lot of the stories could be identified to particular Syriac books. Now, I don't have notes on that to hand, but one example that I can think of is the story of Abraham taken from the fire, which you find in the Quran. Now, what's interesting about that one
that's in chapter 21, verses 51 to 71.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that one is there was a Syriac writing. I think it was Jonathan ben something or other.
No, that's the one with chapter 5, verse 31. The one with chapter verse 21 is the Talmud of Rabbah. The Talmud of Rabbah refers to that incident and refers to him being thrown into a fire.
Okay, I stand corrected now. I literally don't have that reference to hand, but the key thing was in the Syriac version of the story, the word Ur was mistakenly translated into fire. The word Ur actually in Babylonian means city, and so it was mistakenly in the Syriac version considered to be the word for fire. So they translated into Syriac as fire. And what does the Quran do? It talks about Abraham being rescued from the fire.
There you go.
So that's just one. That's one example.
That's the Bar Sanhedrin you're referring to, chapter 5. If you look in the Bar Sanhedrin, you will see that is the story that you see there. It's confusing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's putting the word fire there for the word Ur, which is a city place, is what you're saying. That is the word for fire that they confused.
Yeah. So the actual city where Abraham was from, Ur, in near Babylon, is actually just the word for city.
Confusing one word.
Language.
But isn't it fascinating? That then gets into the Quran. So what was Wansbrough saying when he was pointing this out?
Well, essentially what he was saying that instead of having a supernatural explanation for the creation of the Quran, everything could be explained by the cultural context in which it was created. So he could see that the stories came from the locale, the context of the stories could be explained by the locale, the religious history of the area could also help to explain how the book came to be created. And obviously, it's 50 years ago, and scholars have discovered an incredible lot since that time.
I want to just put up this. Whoops, I got the wrong one. Let me put this one up first. Look at this question here. Why are the non-Muslims that do all this type of research, why would you say that is the case? This is from Michael de Vries.
Yeah, I think a lot of Muslims are, first of all, they're taught not to ask questions. It's discouraged. And so they're taught to accept what their local imam has told them, and they're encouraged to not ask questions because that is seen as impious. And so they very rarely delve into this, and when they do, it's usually in a very defensive manner. I think that's the shame, really, because I think it is in Muslims' interest to do this sort of research because it's good to distinguish what is historical and what is not historical, so that you're actually following what's true as far as you're able to.
Okay, and I just to add to that, I think one of the big problems is take a look at the Muslim institutions around the world. There is no historical critique that I'm aware of in any of these institutions. The historical critique is a Western paradigm. It starts from a Western paradigm, and I would say even more specifically, the whole idea of historical criticism is a biblical paradigm. It is really a Christian paradigm. This has only been done on the Bible. It's not been done on the Quran.
No. It was developed by the Germans in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so it's just completely foreign to the Arabian sort of mindset to actually question these things, because the thing is, why would they look for these sort of answers? Because if you accept that all of this was received in a divine revelation to Muhammad, there's no need to find any more information. It's a closed book. But if you are looking for a natural explanation, obviously that will lead you to look into the historical context.
Okay, here's another question. Do you know the population of Mecca, Medina, and the surrounding area at the time of Muhammad? Are you aware of anything, Mel?
All I would say is that the Romans called that area Arabia Deserta, which means abandoned Arabia. And to me, that would suggest that there was a very, very thin population at that time. In fact, almost nothing in terms of a population there.
Okay.
I would talk about Mecca as a hamlet at best.
So this is rather surprising if this is the center of the world, if this is the center of what should have been happening from what the Islamic traditions tell us. This is where the great empire, the Islamic empire, was being birthed. There was an awful lot of activity. There was a place called Mecca. It was a center of trade, north, south, east, and west. It dominated. By the time the Muawiyah came to power, it controlled all the way from Tripoli in the west, all the way to Afghanistan in the east. All that land was under its control. Certainly, someone should have known about it.
Yeah, and there's actually no archaeological evidence to back up the claim that there was a city of Mecca prior to the 9th century. They can't find anything. Whenever they've dug under the ground, all they've found is sand. And of course, the Saudis have done a great job at deleting that history as well by building these high-rise buildings and with no regard to the history that they've destroyed, which is kind of suspicious, because it leads me to think that they don't believe that there was anything there to save in the first place.
Well, it's kind of come to fruition, hasn't it? The only thing they have found, from what I understand, is an old Ottoman fort from the last century.
Yeah. There's a question there, I think, is there? Do you think the Quran was created to be an institution that gathers all the beliefs of the occupied nations to give the new rulers kind of acceptance and legitimacy? No. I have a different theory on that. My theory, I've been doing some research, and this is kind of provisional, and this is literally my research as of this week. So what my research is suggesting is that there was a sect prior to Islam that Islam subsumed into itself, which was Abrahamist. And I've found a number of historians going way back to the 3rd century that refer to this sect, and has all the characteristics of Islam except for the absence of Muhammad. So, for example, we have Tertullian in the 3rd century, and he has a chapter talking about monogamy, and he's in dialogue with a group he doesn't name, who are followers of Abraham, who believe in bigamy and polygamy. And the characteristics of it are noticeably very similar to Islam. And then there is another historian called Sosiminos, who writes in the 5th century, and he explains that there was a sect of the Arabs, which he says believed that there was a religion that had originated from Abraham that they were following. And over time it became paganized, and then later they came in contact with the Jews, and they heard about Moses, and so they became huge followers of Moses and Aaron, who they refer to as Musa and Harun. And then later they came in contact with Christians, particularly around the 4th century. So you have them coming in contact in Petra and Arabia with Arian Christians. So you see a lot of that Arian beliefs there in Islam. Now the evidence is incredibly strong. It's still very controversial, because this is literally hot off the press. This was something that Yehuda Nevo mentions in his book Crossroads to Islam. And so I've been investigating the evidence for that. And what's interesting is, if you look at Sebios reports Muawiyah writing to the Emperor Constans, and he says for him to reject that Jesus and accept the God of Abraham. So it's interesting that he doesn't refer to Muhammad, he doesn't refer to Islam, but he refers to the God of Abraham. And so my hunch is what Islam is simply the Abrahamist sect repackaged with Muhammad as the cherry on the cake.
We're going to come back to that, and that's something we need to unpack an awful lot more. You're saying names that people don't know, so in some ways you're going over their head on this. Be careful that we keep it down so people can understand. But let me just bring up this thing that Colin from Islamic Critique has mentioned, referring to the fire that you're referring to in Ur. That name, Ur, fire, is a typical rabbinical wordplay that the Quran picks up as history. And this is normal. This is what happens over and over again. If you're not following, if you don't know the background, if you don't know the background of what these words are, you can see that they assume that this was a place, not reference to fire. And that's going back and flipping on what you had said earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's continue on with some more of these, and let's go ahead and ask some of the questions now. This is one that comes from Constance again. I guess the Quran was also meant a recruiting tool for fighters, not as a spiritual manual. I assume what he means by this is, and I think what he is referring to is the fact that so much of the Quran, especially the first half of the Quran, refers so much to violence, refers so much to jihad, refers so much, what, about 150, 160 verses that are all to do with violence, and that's why he's seeing it as such. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think, say, for example, Surah 9 is the obvious one where there's an awful lot of references to violence. I think that was an Abbasid addition to the Quran at a time when Islam was expanding into, across the Middle East and North Africa, and there was a great need to motivate those fighters to do this holy work of jihad. So I would say that was in addition to earlier texts. Like there was some carbon dating of some parts of the Quran which seem to suggest that they are from the 6th century. So I would argue that these are actually the remains of the Abrahamist sect, and that a large part of what they did was they took those texts from the earlier sect and they cut them and spliced them and put them together and created a book or a manual, if you like, where there's actually very little reference to Muhammad. There's, I think, 169 references to Moses in the Quran. There's only 4 references to Muhammad, which is incredible. I think there's 69 references to Abraham. There's 25 references to Aaron or Harun. And Isa is also referred to, I think it's 24 times. Now, if you take those 4 people, these are 4 people that were key to the Abrahamist sect. And one of the things that I was going to refer to as well is to date, there have been 30,000 rock inscriptions found across the whole Arabian plains. 30,000 inscriptions. Can you guess how many references to Muhammad that they found so far?
Well, I know from prior to 690, 0.
Exactly, 0. In fact, the only times you find Muhammad mentioned in the rock inscriptions prior to the year 700 are in public inscriptions. In other words, they are only written by the Umayyads themselves and not by the popular people. The popular people don't know of this Muhammad, which is very interesting. But yet, there is no problem finding references to Abraham, Musa, Harun, and Isa. And, when I first saw Isa mentioned in the Quran, I thought, oh, silly Muhammad, he made a mistake. But interestingly, Isa has been found in 36 locations on rock inscriptions, all up in northern Arabia and Syria and the Transjordan area, which actually confirms all the other evidence, like Dan Gibson's evidence, Patricia Crone's evidence. And another person that I would also like to mention is Dr. Ahmad al-Jalad. So he did an interesting thing. He noticed that the language in the Quran was very different from classical Arabic. So what he did was he went around looking at inscriptions, trying to find that type of Arabic in the locales. And he expected to find it among the Bedouin, but it didn't match up with the Bedouin. Where he did find it was in the Nabatean areas.
Okay.
Which again,
for those of you who aren't aware what we're talking about, the Nabateans are the northern area. That's where Petra is, and that's where Dan Gibson has found all the mosques are facing towards Petra. This is the sanctuary. It looks like for the earliest mosques that go up until 706. Nothing before 706 faces anywhere but Petra, and they don't even begin to face Mecca until 727. So the Arabic that this Arabic that we find in the Quran is not at all from the Hijaz, is not at all from the central part of Arabia where supposedly Muhammad lived. It all is symptomatic of the Arabic that is found only in the northern part, proving that this Quran, the book that we have in our hand today, this Arabic is from the northern area. Now, it did filter down afterwards and move into all of Arabia, but not that early. And that's why what Al-Jalad's coming up with is he's saying, listen, the Quran that we've got in our hands today could not have come from Muhammad. He didn't say that. We're saying that. But it could not have come from someone that early, that far south. It had to have come from much further north. It's a much more stylized Arabic. It's derived from the Nabatean, Aramaic and Syriac that you will see as we're going to get into the Quran. We'll be unpacking this more. Here's a real quick question I just wanted to show you here. I just had it, now I've lost it. Going back to Petra itself. Let me just see if I can find it again. If this person's asking, the moon god. Are you familiar with anything about the moon god in Petra? Have you come across this at all, Mel?
Yeah, I've heard Dan Gibson's explanation, and he connects it with Hubble. But in fact, it's quite a while since I've looked at that side of things. I kind of take a much simpler explanation. Allah was a common generic word that was used by both Christians, by the various different sects. So it was quite a common word. If you go far back into the origins of the word, you will find pagan origins to the word. But I think by the time of the 7th century, it was a relatively neutral word. Like even in Syriac, the word is Allah, which is very similar. So I wouldn't take too much stock on that. The only thing I would say is that around the time when Islam began, while there was a sect called the Abrahamics, the majority of the Arabs at that time were pagan. And so it took about 40 years from, say, the advent of Islam, which I would put at 690. It takes about 40 years before most of the Arabs start to convert to Islam.
Yeah.
And that's why
Just to be fair, the ilaha or the Allah that we're referring to is just a generic title. It's not a name at all. It's nothing more than a title for the God, much like it is even today in Arabic, the God, with the alif lam, which is the definite article. So if that were the case, then that the God must be referring to some particular God. Now there are references to the God being referring to Dushara. This is the work that we've come from the Nabatean sector. The Nabatean god, that is the god of Petra, is known as Dushara. Hubal would be from further south, but Dushara is the god that from that particular city. He has a wife named Al-Uzza, whose generic title is Alat, which is the feminine form of Allah. So if you're just looking at the title itself, the goddess, the god, the goddess, the female, male and female, who are referring to Dushara and his wife Al-Uzza. Two of those, Alat and Al-Uzza, are from the satanic verses found in chapter 53 of the Quran, verse 19 and 20. These are the satanic verses that still bother Muslims today because they're still in the Quran, proving to me at least, suggesting very clear that this is not the moon god of Petra. This is actually a very well-known god and his wife. Which, if that is the case, and if you want to go with that ilaha, or if you want to go with that Allah, then how could God have a wife? Because that's in chapter 6, verse 101. It says very clearly in the Quran that God or Allah has no consort. Allah has no wife.
The Arabs at the time had a lot of problems with the ambiguity of the name Allah. So in order to distinguish themselves from each other, they had to add things to define their God. So they would say, for example, the Lord of Musa and Haran, which is Moses and Aaron, or the Lord of Ibrahim and Isa. So that was a way they got around that. But if they left it just as Allah, it was so ambiguous. It could refer to the pagan god, it could refer to the Abrahamic god, it could refer to any of the sects. The other thing I would like to refer to is the area of orthography, which is the idea of spelling. Dr. Ahmed Al-Jalad did an interesting talk there recently, and he pointed out that the spelling in the Quran itself is inconsistent, which suggests that there are different time frames in different parts of the Quran. And my colleague Murad has actually said to me that the spelling of Ibrahim is actually spelt differently in different parts of the Quran, which is very odd for a book that's perfect and perfectly preserved. So that's not even comparing two different Arabic Qurans. It's within one version of the Quran. There's inconsistencies there with the spelling.
Colin from Islamic Critique is just backing up what we're saying here. That he's quoting from Mark Dury's newest book out, The Quran and its Biblical Reflections, and where he quotes, what we can be quite sure about is that the clear Arabic in which the Quran was first recited was not the native dialect of the Meccans.
Absolutely.
If you go on, Mark Dury then says further on, he refers to Al-Jalad in his book on that. He quotes Al-Jalad in his book, the very same person you're quoting, who claims that this is a much northern dialect, and from the Nabatean area, which supports what we now know from all the mosques, which supports what we now know from all the architecture, which supports what we now know from all the manuscripts. It seems to be all these different strands of historical critique that are coming in are all pointing to a much further north location for where Islam was initially birthed. Moved down later on to Mecca, obviously, once it was first chosen by Al-Zubair and then was sanctified later on by the Abbasids, who come in 749.
Yeah, another area of interest is the script itself. Unfortunately for the Quran, the script wasn't fully established by the time the Quran was written. It was still in a stage of development, and this is something that I know you've referred to in very recent videos. But one example that Al-Jalad refers to is the letter Hey, which originally was a circle with a dinticle or a tooth coming from the side of it. And this was later dropped for a different shaped letter. And this caused an awful lot of confusion later on when scribes were transcribing the earlier versions of the Quran to the newer ones. It led to lots of confusion and mistaken letters in the Quran, which has caused so much of the confusion nowadays.
Yeah. Okay. There's some other. There's a question here about when we believe the Quran was actually compiled. Was it compiled in the 8th century? This is from Austin O'Keefe. Do you think the Quran was compiled around the turn of the 8th century from other manuscripts, and is the Sana the earliest near complete Quran, and is Muhammad mentioned in that?
Yeah, I would suggest I would take John of Damascus as a very good witness to what was going on. So John of Damascus in the 730s only refers to surahs as separate units, and he refers to them as, like, for example, Surah 2 he refers to as a book by itself, a standalone book. So that would suggest that they hadn't canonized the Quran even by the 730s. And if we take into account that, for example, Surah 9 has very strong Abbasid tones, that would push you past the 750s. If we look at the rock inscriptions, in the 780s and 790s, you only start to begin to see some of the theology of Islam in those rock inscriptions. So you could be talking at least the late part of the 8th century, if not the 9th century, before you have anything approaching a stable Quran. That's my view. I don't know where you stand on that, but I would say the late 8th century.
Yeah, I'm gonna be agnostic on that. I don't dare give a date right now because we don't really know. What we do know, specifically about the Sana manuscript, it is a palimpsest. And let me see if I have the book right here to hand. I can't see it. Here it is. This is the book that has just come out by Asma Hilali, the Sana palimpsest. It is a palimpsest, which means it has a lower layer. There are 60 verses in that lower layer. And when you look at those 60 verses, there are 70 manuscript variants within that lower layer. Now, by virtue of that, you can see then why Asma Hilali, she has a real problem, because she wants to be very conservative. She has to be very conservative. She wants her books to be sold, this book to be sold, and she wants to be careful not to come out with any hard statement, as I'm not willing to do right now until we have more material in. What we do know, though, is the upper layer is dated to around 705. The lower layer would be 7th century. They would like to say it's as close to Uthman, 660 to 650 to 660. I don't agree with that. I don't think many scholars would agree with that. It's probably late 7th century, possibly during the last 2 decades when Abd al-Malik would be in power, which would make sense. But those 60 verses, the fact that they don't agree with the upper layer and they don't agree with the Quran that we have in our hand today, suggests to me that this is a nascent Quran. This is the beginning of a Quranic manuscript, and it's only 60 verses. It's not complete. They're not the same order that we have in the Quran we have today. They don't agree with the upper layer, suggesting again that because it's a palimpsest, remember with palimpsest, these are animal skins, and when you write on animal skins, if you write something that's incorrect, you can wash it off and then write over top. At the time that you do so, there's nothing to be seen of the lower text. Hundreds of years later, like we have today, that ink starts to bleed through, and that's why we can start looking, and we now notice the ink that has bled through, and we're doing a comparison between the 2 copies, the lower and the upper. She's the first to publish a book. Now, what she does, Mel, she says that this is nothing more than an example of what they call school texts. Why is that a problem to you? I know what it's a problem to you. I want to hear what you would think about that. What does she mean by school text, and why are you laughing?
Well, I'm laughing because it's the idea that you would use expensive parchment to practice your writing is just ridiculous. Maybe you might get papyrus to write on, but you wouldn't be using expensive.
Animal skins cost an awful lot of money. You're right.
Yeah,
Only wealthy people. Nobody would ever give this to a student. Nobody in their right mind would give it to a student. What's more, and here's a corollary to that: if this is a student text, why is it this is the only text that's survived 1,400 years? Why is it this is the only one that has come down to us that we can look at? And I would suggest that the fact that they were starting the Quran, they were realizing as they were borrowing, much of the Quran is borrowed from other sources. It was not making sense. They were making corrections. You can even see references in the lower text to don't do this, do this. And that's why she's saying this is a cool text. This is a student. This is a teacher saying to a student. No, it isn't. It's actually them trying to create the Quran, trying to put it together, making mistakes, washing it off, and then finally writing over top of what their final edition is. And even then, that is not even a complete Quran. When you look at the Sana manuscript, we only have about 22% of the Quran in that finalized text, if that is finalized. Of course, there's still much more to be done. That's why we're being rather agnostic on dating it. But Mel, you go with the 9th century that it's finalized.
I would say in terms of finalized, yeah, there are sections of this of the Quran that are there in the early 8th century. But what's interesting is the Quran seems to grow over the century. So we seem to have about 40 surahs in some manuscript collections in the early part of the 8th century, and then we get to about 112 surahs later.
Okay, Michael's saying here that this must have been Muhammad must have plagiarized. Do you think Muhammad had anything to do with this?
No, I don't think he had any act or part to it. I think that is one of many retrojections. Because the thing is, if Muhammad did all of the things that he's claimed to have done, we should be seeing rock inscriptions of him all over the place and not a single one. So that suggests to me that they only belatedly acknowledged them probably for Arab interests. It was good to have a figurehead that would inspire the nation and rally the troops. I don't think if he did what he's supposed to have done, I think you would find lots more evidence everywhere.
Okay, now I want to bring up another subject here. This is Bart Connolly bringing this up, and this is, I don't know if any of you have seen what has happened in the last week. Shabir Ali made an enormous statement a week ago. Actually, a week ago today, on the 19th, a little over it yesterday, where he claimed that he finally admitted, after all these years, he finally admitted there are differences in the Quran. Did you see those videos?
I did, yeah.
I've been responding to them in the last 2 days.
Sorry. What I would say in response to it, I don't know what your initial reaction to it is. Like, in terms of, say, the Bible for us, if there are some variations over time, that's not a big issue, because for us, Jesus is the number one word of God. That the Bible is merely a human record of that. But for the Quran, it's a different story. This is meant to be the perfect writing from eternal tablets that has come down without any change or variation. So it's a different claim in Islam to Christianity. So it's a big deal in Islam.
This is huge because every Muslim, including Shabir Ali, as long as I have been working in Islam for 40 years now, every Muslim has always avowed that this book, the Quran, is the eternal word of God. It is on those eternal tablets. The Quran itself makes that claim in chapter 85, verse 22. If this is the eternal word of God, that's the Arabic, not the English translation, but the Arabic that you see here, is it the eternal word of God? It cannot have any human interference at all. No human interference whatsoever. Now, here is good old Shabir Ali. God bless him. He is finally admitting, after how many years, how many debates have I done? I've done 6 debates with this guy. We're good friends. He is, he is being honest here. It is obvious to him that there is a problem here. It's obvious to him that he's getting questioned. Remember, I did a debate with him in 2014 where I introduced to him 800 variants, and these were not Qira'at. This has nothing to do with Qira'at. These words had nothing to do with ahruf. These had to do with the razm. The razm is the consonantal text. I probably am speaking Greek to an awful lot of you. This is the Arabic word that we're referring to. And at that time, in 2014, he couldn't come up with any rebuttal. And you can see since that time, there has been reference after reference. There has been claim after claim. Or you can understand why he had to say something this last week. He did. And what he said was, yes, there are differences. You have the Hafs manuscript on one hand, which is the 1924 Egyptian text, and you have the Wash. He was referring to the North African. He didn't give the name. It's called the Wash from North Africa. He was only giving two. He only wanted to give those two. There's actually, we've come up with a 37. That's Hatun Tash there, my colleague in London. She's come up with all 37 that she has been able to find just herself, or people that she has used on her team to go and find these different derivations. Now, what he was saying is that there are differences. He didn't want to say they're substantial. In fact, he said just the opposite. These don't change any belief, and they don't change any practice. He's mimicking what we say about our variants, because we also know that there are variants on the Bible too, but none of them change any doctrine.
I would argue one of the doctrines that does change is the doctrine that the Quran has never changed. That's a huge part of the doctrine. So I don't know what he's talking about. That's pretty massive. If he believes that the Quran had come down to correct the corruption that exists in the Bible, and yet the Quran doesn't manage to do that, that's a big deal.
In chapter 10, verse 15, in chapter 15, verse 9, and I think it's in chapter 18, verse 27, those three references in the Quran, it's very clear that God preserves his own word. God would never let his word be changed or corrupted, deleted, or accreted. So the Quran itself makes that claim that you're bringing up. If that is the case, then how can you have Shabbat Ali? Remember, who is Shabbat Ali? Well, he's probably one of the world's considered to be the leading debater they have on the Quran in the English language, which means the best debater they have, because it's not debated in any other language as it is in English. Now, he has been saying for years that there is no difference between the Topkapi in the Quran we have today, between the Ma'il in the Quran we have today, between the Tashkent in the Samarkand manuscript in the Quran we have today. These are the three he's always supported. And he's always quoted that they were complete. And they are exactly the same words, the same letters. I remember in my debate that I had in 2014, he would talk and go over, and he spent 19 minutes referring to this, that if you look at these set of words and these set of words, they make 19. They come up to the number 19. If you look at these letters with these letters, they come up to the number 19 over and over and over again, showing that this is such a piece of magic. This is such a magical book that you can find 19 all the way through it. No other book can make these type of claims. And that was his support for the Quran, for its miraculousness. At that time, I remember when I heard that in my rebuttal, I turned to him and says, what verses are you talking about? If you take a look at this Quran and you take a look at any other Quran, the verses are not the same. What's more, these verses didn't exist that early. The verses aren't even the same order that early. In fact, look at all these manuscripts that I've just put up on the screen. Not one of them has the versification in it. Versification was not standardized anytime early. In fact, it's still not standardized today. He finally had to admit, after about an hour and a half of debating, he finally had to admit that the versification he's talking about is the Hafs text. He called it the 1924. He's still calling it the 1924. He doesn't want to call it the Hafs because he knows Hafs is the name of a man who died in 796. That's 144 years after Muhammad. That's very specific, and it's very late. And that's why late 8th century, you cannot say that is the Quran. That would be the same as Uthman. It's in that case, it's just over 100 years later. Now,
one of the things I would like to bring up, if I may, is the key period from 690 to about 710. It's kind of telling that most of the key events in terms of the establishment of Islam occurred during those years. So, for example, according to the Islamic tradition, it was Al-Hajjaj who gathers the Quran during that period. He introduced the praying using the Quran in the 690s. You also have a rock inscription for the Masjid al-Haram, which is dated to 698. And what's interesting about that is that Muslims often put a spin on that and say, well, it was rebuilt in that year. But actually, if you read this inscription itself, it does not say rebuilt, it just says built. And if they wanted to say rebuilt, they could have. So that requires further explanation. And it's interesting that rock inscription was later destroyed.
Yeah.
all we have now is a photograph of that rock inscription. The earliest reference to
Just before you go on to the next one, before you go on to that,
Yeah.
Islamic awareness does say it was rebuilt. They put rebuilt in there. Wow. And we have noted to tell them you can't do that. That's not what it says. It says built, number one, the first time. So if that's the initial building, or rebuilt, or sorry, it's the other way around. It's been rebuilt. It's not the first time. It's been rebuilt. They want to take the re out of it. So you need to be careful with these, that you actually quote it correctly. And that's good when you brought it out. Thanks for doing that.
The earliest reference to the Hajj is not in the 7th century, it's the 8th century. So we have a papyrus that's dated from I think it's 707 to 717 or thereabouts. It was in that time frame. And it was the nephew of Abd al-Malik who wrote a letter to a governor in Egypt. So that's our first reference on papyri. The first reference on a rock inscription is 702. So it's interesting that Hajj is not recorded anywhere prior to that as of to date.
Okay.
And the change of the introduction of the mihrab then was 706 as well. So you see a lot of these key things were introduced in those 20 years.
Mel, we're going to have to put a timeline together, and we're going to have to start showing the timeline and having people understand where these actually appear. I think that's something you and I can do. Maybe Morad can help us with that. Why don't we start putting a timeline together, start sticking it up there, and as we start speaking, just keep adding to that timeline as different things are brought forward. I think that would make it help people who are listening, because we're putting out dates, we're putting out names, we're putting out events, we're putting out inscriptions, we're talking about all kinds of trade route theories and all the other things. It gets confusing for many of you who are listening. I can understand that. It might be good if we get a little more visual on this. We're going to continue these. I see that I'm over an hour now. I'm sorry about the technical problems we had at the very beginning. It seems it was on my end. It's nothing to do with Mel. But what we're going to do now is we're going to start bringing it down to a conclusion. What I do want to say is that in 2 days, at 1 o'clock, the same time, that time we won't have any technical problems. I'm bringing Robert Spencer on board. I have a series of questions I want to ask him, but I want you people to ask questions as well. Could you, at the bottom of this live stream, could you write your questions specific to what Robert Spencer is doing? Now, remember, Robert Spencer, it has an enormous amount of experience. He's written many books. He has been able to not only confront Islam head on, has been at the forefront of this more so than myself or others. It's in the public sphere. We need to honor this man, but also we need to use his mind. He's got an amazing mind. He's got a brilliant mind. I loved what he did last week when we were just sit there. We just for 1 hour, through question after question, he could answer every one of them eloquently. The fellow has not only the background, but he also has the communication skills to be able to put it together so you can understand it. Come with us on Friday. That's in 2 days at 1 o'clock here in Eastern Standard Time. For those of you in London, Mel, in your case as well, it'll be 6 o'clock in the evening. We won't have this technical problem. We will get together. Now, as we run this live stream down, we need to go because I've got people waiting for me. I can see them they're right over here waiting for me, and I've got to make sure that I keep to my schedule. Mel, just give me about 5-minute overview of how you think this all takes place. Don't give me a lot of dates, names. We've got all that. Kind of give looking down from a helicopter. You're from space now. You're looking down, looking into the 7th century. What do you see is happening, starting with 622 and ending with 690?
Yeah. So from say 622, the Arabs had sought their freedom from the Byzantines and the Persians. There were various prophets of the time. Muhammad was possibly one of those, but he was soon forgotten about. I believe the Abrahamic sect was a key element going into the 690s. And so when Abdul al-Malik put the rock inscriptions, he used a predominant amount of the Abrahamist rhetoric, but he introduced Muhammad to the world, and they took various texts from the, I would say, the Abrahamic sect, but also from other Syriac sources. And Al-Hajjaz was key in that development, and he seems to be the one that was driving that Quranic creation. But he was just a first step. Into the 8th century, then the Quran was gradually refined as they developed their theology, probably in reaction to critiques of their religion. So that's how I see it developing over time.
So you've jumped right to the 690. Let's back up to 622. You have you have the Arabs. You have the Arabs who conclude mostly are Christian at this time, are they not? In 622, who are defeating, not so much that they're defeating, they are actually following on the coattails of the Byzantines, who are defeating the Persians, the Sassanids at this time.
Yeah, I think it was a collective movement. So the Mu'minin, I think I've pronounced it wrong, but the Mu'minin was the believers movement, and that was a movement around the monotheistic belief. So anyone who believed in one God could be part of that. So they were the main drivers in terms of this early part of the Islamic tradition. But I would argue that it was all a bit of a mess, and it really only started to become unified really at the time of Muawiyah. And he is the one really that you see abundance of rock inscriptions and references in various sources. And he seems to be the one that united Syria with Iraq and Egypt and so on, whereas before that, it seemed to be just local chieftains at best. And a lot of the civil wars were because of that lack of unity.
Okay, so you have Heraclius taking over, destroying the Sassanids in 630. We've moved 8 years now, up to 630. Heraclius is the Christian Byzantine king. You have these tribal leaders who are in the east, who are taking on, who still have the very strong Zoroastrian theological religion. On the western side, you have those who are Christians. By the time you get to Muawiyah in 660, 661, when he takes over, what do you know about Muawiyah? Who is he? Where does he stand religious-wise?
I think he was an Abrahamist, and the reason for that is simply that he calls the emperor to the God of Abraham. So to me, that's a clue. He does come across as if he were a Christian, in terms of the fact that when he went to Jerusalem, he prayed on the hill of Gethsemane and visited various Christian churches to pray. But I think he was more an Abrahamist. What else?
So what you might say, when you say Abrahamist, you mean from the line of Abraham, like the Ishmaelites and the Hagarenes that you're referring to?
It was a particular religious grouping which had, let's say, about 95% of the beliefs and practice of Muslims. All that happened in subsequent years is that Muhammad became central to it, and it was presented as if Muhammad was the founder of that religion. But if you think about the common Muslim perception that there were Muslims back at the time of Abraham and Moses and so on, I think that stems from the fact that this older sect actually did believe that their religion had come from all the way back to the time of Abraham. So that's the way I view it. And I think a lot of the conflicts that occurred during the 7th century were primarily to do with the Ghassanids, who were the Syrians, essentially in the western part, versus the Lakhmids. And these were formerly the buffer zones between the Byzantines and the Sasanians. So what I see in terms of the conflict between, let's say, Muawiyah and Ali, it's just a continuation of that conflict between the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids. Okay.
So the Ghassanids are in the northern section, the Lakhmids are coming the eastern. Yeah. And so you have these two up here. They were the buffer states that were being paid to control the Arabs in the central part. And that's why, as long as they were being paid, they did their job. Once they no longer were being paid, they just let the Arabs then go right through and seep through and take over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo in 630s, 640s, up until the time of Muawiyah. Now, it's fascinating what you're talking about, him being Abrahamic. He does have in his coins, the backside of the coins, Zoroastrian fire altars. So it seems to be that he was giving tribute to the Sassanids still in the eastern areas. The coins that he coined in the western areas did have a cross. So he did have a cross on his head piece and also on his hands. What does that suggest?
Well, I think it suggests that he had to keep the populations in each area happy. It doesn't suggest that he was a member of a religion that was against the use of crosses. So that undermines the Islamic tradition.
Okay, because for the Islamic tradition, in the 9th and 10th century, says that Muawiyah is the first of the Umayyad Caliphate, he was part of the Sufyani family. So that completely destroys that notion that he was a great, well-known and supporting Muslim.
Yeah, one of the things I would suggest that there's an interesting detail from Sebios, which undermines another element of the theory. Sebios says that the Jews from Edessa went to meet Muhammad in a place that he refers to as Tazakistan. I think I've pronounced it right. Tazakistan, I think is how you pronounce it. Now, this is a place I'd never heard of, and it actually, Murad on my team has actually spent the last few months trying to dig up a map where that was mentioned on. We thought that it might have been way off near the Caspian Sea, but we actually discovered that this was the name of northern Mesopotamia. It was an unusual alternative name. So if this is true, this would suggest Muhammad was not an Arab, but potentially someone from northern Mesopotamia, which would totally put a different spin on it. But what's interesting, even though this is very controversial, is that Ali, who's supposed to be of Muhammad's family, was the emir of Hira, which is the capital of the Lakhmid area, which is where you find northern Mesopotamia. So what's interesting is, even though some of the historical records seem to contradict what we've come to accept, i.e. that Muhammad was from Arabia way down in the Hijaz, when you look at some of the overlooked historical records, it seems to suggest an alternative take, which is that perhaps this person who has been referred to as Muhammad, whose real name we actually don't know, may have actually come from a different area. And it's interesting that there's even a Chinese chronicle that suggests that Muhammad was a Persian, which is very odd. It's kind of so against the common tradition that it kind of makes you wake up and think, well, is there something behind this, or is it just a simple mistake? Because usually when something odd appears in the record, it's either a mistake or it might be a major clue in terms of piecing together the jigsaw. But obviously what I've just said to you is quite controversial, and it is very new and very different to what a lot of people would have heard of before. But it's a different take.
I just want to end with Austin O'Keefe. He's an ex-Catholic. He says, did the same historical research on Jesus as we are doing here. And the answer is absolutely, Austin. Listen, we're just scratching the surface on Islam. Nobody has done what we're doing. We're the first to do it. And that's why it seems amazing to you that if you look at the historicity of Jesus, if you look at for 200 years, we've been asking these questions of Jesus, his historicity, about the Bible, about early Christianity. The only reason why we can even do what we're doing today is because that has already been done on the Bible and on Jesus Christ. All of these criticisms, we notice we've done source criticism today. We're doing redacted criticism, putting back on things that said later onto what is said earlier. That's exactly what the Islamic tradition has done. That's called redacted criticism. We've looked and seen where some of these references are in the Quran, and they're coming from apocryphal writings, and many of them Jewish apocryphal accounts, Christian sectarian accounts. That is coming out from Christian material that it was put out at the time of in the 1800s, late 1800s in Germany. So this has all been done on Christianity. We're way ahead of the rest of the game. What's amazing is that almost every one of these critiques that have been put together in the 1800s and the 1900s, leading up into the 2000s that we're living in today, all of this is now for the first time being put against the Quran. And listen, there's very few of us that are doing this. Islamic Critique is doing a great job. Colin's doing a great job there. Mel's doing a great job. We know that David Wood has been doing a great job. So has Sam Shamoun been doing a great job. And probably the one that I like the most, the one that I've been really impressed with is our good man right here, Robert Spencer, who I'll be having on Friday. We do need to bring it to an end there. We do need to come back, and want to thank you, Mel, for coming on board. We'll be doing some more of these with you. What we'll do in the future is not such a broad overlook, because today we just wanted to introduce you. I wanted the people from Fander Films to get to know who you were, so they will be familiar with you. But you've done a great job of giving us a great introduction. You've got a fine mind. You're doing an awful lot of research with Murad. I see a lot of comments here are surprised that you are Northern Irish. I don't know why that would be surprising. And you can see
I'm Southern Irish, actually.
Oh, he's Southern Irish.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then do you understand what they're saying in Irish there? Can you follow that?
I haven't been following the chat, unfortunately, but
They're writing. They're actually writing quite a bit in Irish. Next time we come back, I want to zero in on. I want to zero in on 3 areas that you're now looking at specifically. I want to look at the Dome of the Rock inscriptions with you. We'll probably do that next week. I also want to look at the rock inscriptions, the early rock inscriptions. I'll unpack them and go through them, and then I want to look at the caliphs. You're talking about Abu Bakr, Umar, and Ali, especially those 3 caliphs, what we now know about them and what history is telling about them. What you're doing, Mel, is what most people need to do. And this is something we've said over and over again in Fander and Fander films. Rather than going to the 9th and 10th century, which is way over here, too far away, we want to go back to the 7th century. That's why most of these videos these last few months have been looking at the 7th century. And we want to unpack from the 7th century what actually existed, what actually happened. Have you noticed what Mel's been saying today? Everything he's been saying, he's quoting from the 7th and 8th century. He's not deferring to the 9th and 10th century. I know Muslims want us to always go to the 9th and 10th century. We refuse to do that. So I want to look at those 3 areas. Mel, can we do that maybe starting next week?
Absolutely, yeah. Let's do that.
Okay. Listen, God bless you, Mel. Good to have you on board.
You, Jay.
We have an awful lot to get through. We're going to start really confronting Islam head on with this new material and try to put a timeline together as to how we actually believe Islam began, looking from date to date. From what you're coming up with, what Murad's coming up with, what looking other scholars are coming up with. Pat Anderson has been doing an awful lot of material there in Britain on this. We'll be bringing in his material. We'll be looking at Robert Spencer, what he's been saying. And then we're going to go back and look at all these books here. Look at all these books here. These are the ones where you can't see it. My camera's not on it. But this is the material that we'll be looking at, confronting Islam from the 7th century. This has been a good hour. Want to thank you, Mel. God bless you. And we'll see you next week. This is Jay, over and out.
Thank you. That's great.